Welcome to PAATH History. Today we are going to discuss about the crisis of Roman slavery or crisis in the slave mode of production in Rome. The expansion of Roman Empire had created conditions for the development of the slave mode of production in Italy, Spain, Gaul and North Africa. Roman peace itself became an obstacle for this mode of production. Following the death of Trajan in CE 117, no new territories were added to the empire. Consequently, there were fewer opportunities for capturing slaves in large numbers. Frequent skirmishes with tribal groups settled on the periphery of the empire in northern Africa and in Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the continuous conflict with the Parthians, allowed slave traders and pirates to launch regular raiding expeditions to procure slaves. In the post-Trajan period, the problem became even more serious. By the end of the 2nd century CE, Rome was finding it difficult to contain the threat of tribal incursions, and under these circumstances, raiding expeditions for slave capture could not be supported by the army. The shortage of slaves was reflected in the rising prices of slaves. According to the estimates of A.H.M. Jones, slave prices in the 2nd century CE were 8 to 10 times higher than in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. There was a general shortage of manpower due to two major outbreaks of plague in this period. The empire was ravaged by plague in CE 165 and again in CE 250. This led to a sharp decline in population. As labor became scarce, the landed aristocracy resorted to new methods of surplus extraction. Crookes has argued that by the 2nd century CE, it was no longer profitable to invest in slaves. Initially, the high cost of purchasing slaves was balanced by increasing the level of exploitation of slaves. But this was not possible beyond a certain point, since most of the agricultural slaves already lived much below the basic subsistence level with hardly any food or clothing. The chained gangs of slaves working on latifundia toiled for long hours, and there were absolute physical limits to the amount of labor they could be forced to do. Mortality rates, it must be noted, among these slaves were very high. As slaves became more and more expensive, it was no longer easy to replace the slaves who had died. The first response of the latifundists to this situation was to exploit the slaves even more. That is, they tried to increase the rate of exploitation. This would have resulted in even faster deaths. Besides, this was not a practical solution beyond a certain extent. The crisis in the slave mode of production necessitated some modifications in the system. The availability of cheap slave labor itself was an impediment to technological progress because there was little inclination to introduce labor-saving techniques. The slave owners tried to cope with the crisis in other ways. Slave breeding became a significant economic activity which helped to overcome the shortage of labor for some time. However, successful human reproduction depends on various cultural and biological factors. The ratio of female slaves to male slaves has also to be taken into account, and this ratio might not always have been favorable, especially on the big latifundia. Crooks suggests that slave owners sought to improve the chances of reproduction by encouraging male and female slaves to develop loose family bonds. Such slaves began to form matrimonial and kinship ties among themselves and ceased to be mere commodities. Some of them were settled on individual plots within the large estates, and these plots were cultivated by the slaves with their family labor. Many of the big landowners did not any longer directly organize production on their latifundia, but entrusted this task to slave families which were attached to small plots and had to give a part of their produce to their owners. Under this new system, there was a slight improvement in the status of the slave. The requirements of slave breeding had led to the betterment of the slave's status in many cases due to family ties, having their own holdings no longer being regarded exclusively as commodities, etc. Roman law had a provision which entitled slaves to own some property. This form of property was called Peculium. Of course, it was the owners who determined the quantum of the Peculium. There are references to slaves who invested their Peculium in trade, moneylending, and production. They could themselves own slaves. Part of the profits earned in this manner was handed over to the owner, while the remainder was added to the slaves to earn profits by taking the initiative to organize their own business. These profits were shared by their masters. This was a more efficient way of utilizing the skills of the better trained slaves. As compared to Greece, where instances of slaves being set free were rare, the incidence of manumission was much higher in Rome. Manumission was a formal act and required a legal declaration. The Roman state levied a tax on manumission. The manumitted slave acquired the same civic rights as those of his or her master. Slaves who had been set free owed certain obligations to their former owners, which they had to render whenever called upon to do so. Manumission was more of an urban phenomenon, and it is unlikely that the lowest category of slaves, that is, the agricultural slaves working in chained gangs, ever had any hope. Crooks points out that in the long run, slave breeding was less profitable than slave capture. The modifications of the slave system had the cumulative effect of reducing the rate of exploitation. If the rate of exploitation decreased, the aristocracy could keep up its lavish lifestyle only by adopting other methods of surplus extraction. This the aristocracy succeeded in doing by placing a greater burden on free peasants, tenant farmers, and hired agricultural workers. These groups were unable to resist the growing extractions of the aristocracy in the West, that means Italy, Spain, and Gaul, due to the enormous power wielded the big landlords in this part of the empire. The inevitable consequence is that the propertied class cannot maintain the same rate of profit from slave labor, and to prevent its standard of living from falling is likely to be driven to increase the rate of exploitation of the humbler free population. So these were the problems, and this is the end of our today's discussion. Subscribe our channel, like our video, and comment. Listen to our podcast episodes. Follow our official Facebook page, Twitter handle and Instagram. For any query, feel free to mail us. For details, see the description.